right, welcome to the Logosphere. This is Chris Stites, here as always with JD Ruf.
Hello, good afternoon.
And this afternoon, we have the pleasure of having a guest on, Shirin Ruf. There it is. And Shirin is a licensed marriage and family therapist and a practicing psychotherapist. But why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and if you have any specialties and what your work looks like and how you got into it and all of that.
Well, thank you for having me. And yes, we just happen to share the last name, Ruf.
It's a coincidence.
Yes. I'm a therapist. I've been a therapist for a lot of years. I've been working in treatment for at least maybe 16, 17 years.
When you say treatment, what do you mean?
Treatment like residential mental health and addiction, substance use disorders, but also some eating disorders. So overall mental health. But my recent focus, like in the past probably 7 to 10 years, has been trauma, complex trauma, PTSD, a lot of trauma treatment, what works, what doesn't, and how to help people and how to kind of just navigate through how that relates to the pandemic and all of that.
How would you define trauma?
Well, I think the definition depends on the different individual, but ultimately it would be defined as a sense of lack of safety and a complete sort of hijacking of what you would perceive as like a home body of self, a sense of self that no longer exists.
Because of something that happened?
Because of something that happened and something that left you feeling powerless and immobilized and completely at the mercy of whatever the situation was, be it abuse or natural disasters or whatever.
Yeah. So there's something called like a trauma response you hear?
There is a trauma response.
What is that?
That's a thing.
Yeah.
That's a real thing. But it's also overdone, which I hope to get into. The word trauma itself is overdone. Everybody's traumatized. And it's hard for me as a therapist who does this for a living to kind of criticize some of this, but ultimately I know it to be true. And it's important that we do something because what we're doing now doesn't really seem to be working. So going back to your question, which was what?
Trauma response. What is that?
Trauma response is when I respond out of what happened to me. So it's not me, this version, this adult, this role of wife, daughter, employee, neighbor. All that has left the building, and I've been completely hijacked by fear and by a survival mechanism, right? My nervous system is now just running the show, and I'm responding out of a place of powerlessness rather than I'm in Thousand Oaks and I'm an adult and I have a sense of containment should I choose to use it.
Do you know much about, like, does our prefrontal cortex go offline during periods like that? Or?
Yes, it's completely hijacked. I mean, trauma changes the nervous system altogether. So what that means is unless it's released and it's repaired, it doesn't just go away with age. It doesn't just kind of, get resolved on its own. Does it
not? I mean, there's this kind of cliche, which is like time heals all wounds. You think about like a breakup or something like that, and what happened, how you feel 1 month afterwards, and then 6 months afterwards, and a year afterwards. So obviously something is naturally taking place aside from the intervention of, say, a psychotherapist that may be similar to, but not as directed or practiced as the work one would do with a psychotherapist.
Depends on the wound, right? So a hard breakup that broke your heart, let's say, or was a difficult toxic relationship that was chaotic, is an experience you're having as an adult. You have the power to leave, you have the power to stay, whereas adverse childhood, for instance, like the real traumatic, the violating trauma of childhood abuse or sexual abuse or being completely powerless in the face of like an earthquake or a natural disaster and being stuck underneath a bunch of concrete like for days. That is different because you're experiencing death, probably slowly, it's inevitable. And the powerlessness that's accompanied by something like that is very different than the powerlessness you would experience as an adult. So time does heal the wounds that are somewhat by choice versus the wounds that are so deeply ingrained, and depends on when it happens. So if something happens to me at 10 versus 25, the effect is going to be very different.
Yeah. There's a course.
Well, I have like kind of a novel question because I don't know a lot about, I'm not a psychologist, per se, but is there a difference between like physical trauma and psychological trauma? Like you're talking about different age groups, right? But like, let's say there's a kid that's getting just berated by adults at a young age, let's say 10, but there's no physical, there's no putting your hands, getting beat, but it's just talking down to. And then is there kind of a spectrum on that? Like if somebody's raped or molested, does that tend to be worse? Like in later in adult life, if it's not, worked through with a therapist.
Well, the age piece is is a huge indicator, but also what you bring up, like the banishment in a social setting. Gabor Mate, for instance, Bessel van der Kolk, these are people that have really focused on the effects of this sense of being rejected, which we call bullying or different things like that, and how the trauma is very much stored in the same way that you would if you were getting beat physically. So in fact, it's a lot more powerful. That's why the psychological piece is a lot more powerful because, for instance, if I'm getting beat as a child, physically harmed, let's say I have bruises, I'm hurting physically, that's bad. And, you can identify that quickly as, well, that's trauma. But then you have people that have never been spanked or beat or have had any physical harm and grew up in a relatively decent upbringing, and it's quiet and it's, seemingly okay, but that are so much more disabled by just the demons, right? And it's like, I'm even more unstable now because I don't have the kind of trauma you have. So I can't say this is where I come from. So, hey, it makes sense why I'm all effed up. But at the same time, if dad is, for instance, beating me, there's effort in that. Like I'm having to go rage and shake you and be mad. But if I'm just completely like this demeanor that's very kind of agreeable and friendly and good night and I love you, but it's like behind that it's complete BS. Because you as the kid can sense you hate each other. Like, who are these people? What is happening here?
Yeah, we lose touch with reality. Yeah.
Well, what it sounds like? Ancient societies, ostracization.
Yeah.
So in the ancient Greek world, it was almost considered worse to be ostracized from society, which was something that if you were acting bad in society, or let's say the policies or the politic was like, hey, F this guy. It was either you're going to be put to death or ostracized, and some guys would pick death. I mean, Socrates picked death over exile.
But,
so that kind of leans to your point.
But for him, it probably wasn't like.
Well, yeah, right. But you know what I mean, though. That's why it's like such a fascinating thing.
Recently I controversially read Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish.
Yes.
Yeah, and from that I did learn that our modern approach to one punishment fits all, which is basically you go to jail or you go to prison. Yeah. And they just modulate the length of time and the severity of that imprisonment. But that's relatively modern revolution, and prior to, I don't remember the era, a couple hundred years ago, maybe less.
Yeah, medieval.
They wouldn't lock people up and keep them in jail cells for long periods of time. Short periods of time, while they quickly decided whether they were going to, how they were going to injure them. Corporal punishment on the body, and so it was either kill them or kick them out of the town square.
But it just seems like, going to your point, Shirin, is like the psychological trauma is like it's more damning.
Well, and even with the physical trauma, there's like trauma centers, emergency room, there's that definition of trauma, which is probably just an injury, like when harm is done. And so if someone gets a bruise, it is technically trauma. It's physical trauma. Yes. But whether you were beat by dad or just shunned by dad, even the beating by dad, when we're talking about in a psychological perspective, it's still the psychological impact that had, right? The bruise goes away. Yes. But the internal psychological trauma is maybe something different from that. It's an injury that happens at the level of our psyche. And the psyche is, of course, a mysterious place. You know, psychology is somewhat controversial, which kind of leads to what you were saying about being a psychotherapist who also has some criticisms about the impact of modern psychotherapy on society and individuals. Yeah.
Well, you know what? Just to piggyback off of that, so how does it come out? Because I mean, this is just for people that maybe don't know as much about it. But like, how does it? So there's a kid that's traumatized psychologically or physically or both, right? Probably both. And now they're 25 and they've never dealt with it. How does that come out? Like how, like that scar that you're talking about that's left in the past that's not healed. What do we do? Is it drug addiction? Is it being
promiscuity,
promiscuous,
like issues with relationships, or
it'll come out. There's
antisocial
no avoiding
behavior.
It. Yeah, or that you're hyper productive and active, and you're running a six-fortune company. Like it comes out in ways that are, you know, sometimes very beneficial and deemed as great, right? But it's that hiding.
This idea is like, if I just keep my room in order and if I just do everything, then I'll be safe.
Right.
Something like that. Hypervigilance.
See, there's no hiding. Like there's no way that you can. This is why any of us, most people go to therapy or seek any kind of help. It's not because we think we should. It's not even because I want to. It's because it no longer is an option. Something is really not working, and I'm forced into, I got to figure out what's wrong with me. Like, what is going on? And so that's when you go to therapy, and then they go, oh, great, let's get back into mom and dad. And sometimes people go, you know, I had a pretty decent upbringing. Like, stop trying to find fault with what happened. They did the best they could. But it's not about what happened. It's not about the story of who did what or how they did not show up in different ways. It's about how it's showing up in your life. So if relationships are a mess and you're just hopping from one to the other, if you can't seem to live in the same place for more than 6 months and just keep moving, if you can't seem to find the same job, or if you don't have at least a couple of long-term effective friendships, like if there's no real stability, that's not a coincidence. Something is off.
Yeah.
Right.
Or maybe you just suck and like people
or
don't want
that.
to be around you.
Well,
you're just kind of a dud of a
what do you think
person.
the
But there's a
percentage-
reason for that.
Right.
Yeah.
And what's
Is there, or is it just like, you know, just they had to scrape the, you know, the gene whatever barrel, and that's what you were left with? And
You may not be like the person everybody loves, but
Yeah.
you're not the person most people are repulsed by or try and avoid. Right? There's a difference.
So how does addiction weave into that, though? You know, because it seems like in most sober communities, you go into like anybody. It doesn't matter if it's drug addiction or drinking or whatever. There's usually some kind of trauma background.
yeah.
Right? Is there like a ratio? Like, is it like every drug addict, alcoholic, or recovering drug addict, alcoholic is got some traumatic background or some event?
Well, I think every addict / alcoholic, I think, has trauma. But not every
trauma
person
has-
that's traumatized has addiction or
Yeah.
alcoholism. Right? Because if you identify as an addict or an alcoholic, that means that you have gone through like the tunnel, the darkest of the dark. And before the admission piece where you come in and actually decide that I can't do this and something needs to seriously be changed, then that means defeat, and you must have really hit a bottom pretty bad. And so in order to be that completely out of control and admit powerlessness, something must have seriously gone wrong. Because if you have because heavy drinking or even using doesn't indicate addiction and alcoholism. You know, I've known plenty of people that were using during college and that it never became an issue and they went on to live fine lives. But if you go to the bottom in the ways that like we go to the bottom, there is something that seriously went wrong. Otherwise, I wouldn't be capable of that level of self-destruction, you know? Like, you know, the typical alcoholic that just wakes up, I don't know who this dude is, I don't know who this gal, like, how did I end up here, all of that. Like, there's no way that a contained, grounded type of psyche would put themselves in that type of position.
Do you think that type of behavior comes from a place of like
Should I put this back?
No, you're good. I just had a little piece of hair in front of you.
It was like right here.
Ooh.
All right.
Okay.
Do you think that type of self-destructive behavior comes from a place of like, I don't value myself, this is what I deserve, this is my past and what I know, and so I recreate it? Or do you think it comes from a place of just maybe being so dysregulated chronically that you're like compulsively trying to just find whatever pleasure you can, and so you aren't in a place where you're weighing the medium to long-term consequences of actions that might bring short-term relief?
Well, the trauma tends to just completely throw your entire system off. So what you deem as pleasure is really more like pain. Or what you deem as pain is just pleasure. Or what you deem as depression, it's just sad. Or what has you fall apart in a panic attack, it's just general, like it's just anxiety.
Yeah.
It's a part of life, right? So
You think about a kid who gets so upset they start hitting themselves. It's interesting, right?
yes.
Yeah.
So that
Or self-harm cutters.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Or eating disorder, for instance. So when, for instance, when a kid is traumatized, there's this sense of, if I were good, if I weren't bad, this wouldn't be happening. So there's a sense of control, like it's my fault. I caused this somehow.
It's kind of like, is it cognitive dissonance, or you know?
It is cognitive dissonance, but at the same time, it has this illusion of control. So as long as I'm good, this won't happen to me, which is not true. And so that brings a sense of control. So with eating, with addiction, I get to control the highs and the lows. I get to control the weight, how it looks. I get to control precisely what I put in my system, like with eating disorder. It's all about control that was once taken away. And so now I'm trying to regain a sense of control. And it comes with addiction, with food, with relationships, with success, even with exercising. This delusion of discipline, which I think is so interesting, and we see it all the time with gyms, for instance, and this obsession with, I'm so disciplined because I went from this to that, like on a physical level, the external image. And I think we're so hyper focused on the appearance of success on an external level, that a lot of us look really good and we're able to maintain these like immaculate diets and, you know, I'm disciplined so I show up to work in this way and that way, but it's all very predictable, right? And it's not, what's really going on is not what appears to be going on.
Yeah. I mean, like the appearance of success is probably a decent proxy for success. You can imagine if you were trying to be successful, you're looking around your environment at people that you deem to be successful, and you see what makes them look successful, and you think that the way you become successful is you look the same way, you adopt the same behaviors, you know. But ultimately, those outer appearances of success, like in a honest way, are usually probably, they come from like genuine success, you know. And what that is a little bit harder to define when it comes to properly managing your relationships, maybe, for instance, how you treat your family,
well, the things that can't be measured, like on social media or on a scale or on a, you know, some sort of productivity measurement. You know, the success that is often the real source of success is not something that is visible, right? It's like confidence is not loud.
But isn't that kind of a paradox? Because you need discipline to be successful, right? Discipline, like JP would say this, right? Like you find freedom in discipline, and you have to have that regimented in your life every day. And if you don't, you're susceptible to depression, anxiety, all the crap, right? So just in general, it's kind of a paradox, right?
Well, discipline is needed, but it's the overcorrection of discipline that's the problem.
So overcorrection.
Yes. So it's like, yes, he talks about, for instance, I'm a huge fan of Jordan Peterson. Most of everything he says I agree with and I love. You know, he talks about clean your room or make your bed. And that's important, which means start with your immediate environment. Before you try and fix the world, fix what's around you. Meaning,
where do you
pick
think
up your
that
shit.
comes from, that idea? It's so simple, you know?
But hold on.
Yeah.
So that idea, right? You can really take that to the next level and then become this obsessively hyper vigilant with cleanliness and with organization and you miss the point
Yeah,
in terms of being
at some
present.
point it's
Like
like
an OCD
dude,
or something, right?
like
yeah.
leave your bed unmade for a day. Like go live your life. you
Right,
know?
right.
Can sometimes be
Yes.
the right.
And that might be growth for you,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So
Interesting.
it's very individualized. So, and he talks about in one of his books or podcasts, he talks about the person that, he had to like go to the grocery store with them. They couldn't touch meat or look
OCD
at
or
meat.
something.
Right.
Oh, he took her to the butcher shop.
Right.
Yeah.
And to go and pick and all that, right? So to somebody who's an overeater, growth might be like stay out of the grocery store for the 4th time today. Versus for this other person is I'm going to go with you so you can learn what it's like to like go and get groceries. So it's not a one size fits all, but the underlying sort of the fundamental values or principles are the same.
Yeah.
How it manifests it might be a little bit different.
I'm thinking about contrary action, which is a common
Yes.
expression in recovery circles. Probably exists for a similar reason, right?
Yes.
It's not this is the right thing. It's doing contrary to the wrong thing and not defining what the wrong thing is because it's somewhat individualized. It would be what you're doing when you're driven by self.
Right.
And that you might be driven by self to undereat, you might be driven by self to overeat, et cetera.
Yeah, and I don't know who says this. Tim something says a very tidy home is like a wasted life. In terms of sometimes you and I have this experience where I would go to different people's homes, especially when kids were little, and I would just look around and go, okay, so it is just me then, because these people have small children and they have very tidy, well put together. There's not shoes and crap everywhere. Like, so how are they doing this? So whatever system they have down implies that we can have this life of family, but you don't see a single crumb or dog hair anywhere. And I used to feel terrible about that, going home and looking around going, well, this is a disaster. And there's like, where do I even start? Not dirty or even hoardery type, but just messy, life messy, right? So just like similar to how I was saying this obsession with the physical appearance of look how disciplined I am. I haven't had sugar for 6 years or whatever the fuck, or carbs. It's like, okay, well, but when was the last time you just sat and did nothing for 5 minutes? Set your timer, sit for 5 minutes, turn everything off and just be.
Yeah. See what
What's
happens.
What's that famous? You
Pascal.
know Pascal.
All of humanity's troubles are because of man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone, something like that.
That's right. So good.
Yeah.
And this is a new sort of concept for me because I'm very A-type, very driven, always have been the person that's like, if you believe it and if you want it, there's no, I can't. Like, you get it done. With education, with even relationships, this notion of, well, nobody could stay happy and committed in a monogamous relationship. And I made it my life's business to go, like, that's what I want. And so what do I have to overcome to be the individual that can actually maintain a relationship that's secure and that's sound, not just on the outside? And so I was a program director of LifeSync Recovery. I started their mental health program from the ground up. Same with Stairways. I helped, I was one of the many people that helped put the program together. That's now very successful. And I would take so much pride in that. I would make it my absolute sole purpose to see it succeed. And in that, I was very much taking pride in, like, that's who I am. That's what I do. But now, probably in the past 3 months, I have slowed down, enough to where I'm still making, meeting the same financial expectations by doing this and that. But this need to show up and be the big boss and have my coffee made and have my room in a certain way in the office, I have noticed how painful it is to just be ordinary. It is like the worst thing you can ever experience in terms of not just how it's showing up with work, but also, for instance, when it comes to athletics. I'm very athletic. I've always been very athletic. So if I go to a gym or if I go to any sort of sport or class, like, I have to be the top person. I can't be somebody that blends.
Yeah.
Like, I have to be the boss.
It feels good to be the boss.
It is, but
or the king.
Yeah.
It's an
queen.
overreach of look what I can do.
Yeah.
And it's like a push, right? I go the extra hours and the labor, like, I do the work so that when I'm in just like a regular Westlake Moms aerobics class, I'm the front top, the person that's pulling moves other people cannot.
Well, it's even like, I'm thinking about Jordan Peterson. One of his old things was like The Lobster. He had this, he would talk about hierarchies, right? He'd be a critic of Marxism, and Marxism saying there's this power dynamic, and there's the haves and the have-nots, and, the oppressed and the oppressor. And, that Marx's issue was he didn't go deep enough, and that like this. So he talked about it was like this study with SSRIs and lobsters. I think it's been a long time since I've heard about it.
Oh, that's right. Didn't they give them SSRIs?
Yeah, and watch like their body language change and things like that. But that the idea that our depression or our like self-regulation is somewhat of like a barometer for ourselves, which it tells us what our position is in the hierarchy. Right? If we're at the bottom and we're on the outside and we're exiled and we're banished, like we have a good reason to be depressed and anxious, because we're unsafe.
Yes.
And so we have this kind of internal barometer that's a social structure that is, we feel good, we feel secure, our nervous systems are regulated when we have different signals which are telling us, oh no, you're good.
Properly oriented, or you're rightly related, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've just noticed, I think what's really fascinating to me, and I've always joked about this, that I'm my own case study, and that's what had me get into therapy to begin with, is this like, let me figure this out. Let me see what's going on with what's coming up right now. What has me just like unravel, or what has me reach. I just have been sort of the person that I have like tens, maybe 15, 20 handwritten journals that I've kept over the years, just picking shit apart in terms of what works, what doesn't, what I want, what I don't want. And so what I've noticed in the past probably 3 months or so is I've lost a lot of my respect for the work that I do, because, I was working at a facility and I was getting I was meeting the financial demands that I have had for many years, right? I've worked, I hustled, I got there. It's like, yes, like this is what I want to make. This is where I want to be. This is the position. I had it all on the outside in the ways that I was reaching for. And here it is. Now I have it. And I saw how much my self-respect and just my self-purpose was just dwindling little by little as we were catering to, it's a luxury treatment center. And so the priority is to how to keep you here, right? Because you're the customer, you're the consumer. If you're not here, we don't get paid. I don't get paid. So how much I had to kind of swallow like the truth versus what do I need to tell you to keep you here another week, or at least until the insurance runs out, right? And so every week by week, I just noticed how irritated I got with myself, with the work. And this is the truth. And Carl Jung talks about this, is you can only take a patient as far as you've gone yourself. So I was saying all the right things, but I was very generic with CBT and DBT and all this evidence sort of treatment models that I don't even believe in because they're complete BS.
So what is?
But that's a whole different story.
Yeah, what is CBT?
That's a bold claim.
Yeah, no, that's a really bold claim. Now we're wading into some murky water.
Let's not get into that. Let's cut that one out.
Yeah.
No.
Well, it's not complete BS, but it's not.
CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy, right?
And
That's
talk
talk therapy.
DBT is dialectical behavioral therapy, which I think is more effective. But CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, works really well for like my 8-year-old. If you do A, you're gonna get B, and if you don't, there's, if you don't feel well about yourself, it's very childlike, black and white, very linear, very predictable. But that doesn't apply to complicated, complex trauma, survival type nervous systems. It's like, if I have a negative thought, here's a very generic CBT type of tool, thought stopping technique. So stop the thought you're having, like, I'm a piece of shit, and take the thought to, I'm really good at whatever you're good at. It's like, okay, that's great, and it might work for the day, except that's like if my plant is dying, I keep coming up with, ways to like get the leaves to get more green or to try and make it appear. Whereas the root is what's causing the damage that's visible, right? We don't want to go deeper because it's too messy. CBT basically says, I can't get my hands dirty. I have 30 days and I need to show your mom, the insurance companies, and your husband or wife that this worked. What happens after that is on you.
Where does that come from? Where does CBT, like, is that
Some
I
psychologist,
can't remember
right?
his name. That's like
It'd be like a modality some psychologist
So what is the name?
would
It's-
create. And there's a protocol, right? It's like
Oh,
you do
yes.
it. This is what you do over this
now,
period
do
of time.
most treatment
this
centers run
frequency.
this kind of gauntlet?
most of them
CBT,
like
DBT.
evidence-based because
Yeah.
it's measurable, and insurance companies like it because you could follow like a guidebook or a workbook, and they like the beginning, the middle, and an end. It's
Yeah.
very like in a box with a bow on it. Whereas
And insurance companies like it.
insurance companies love it because it's like, what are you working on? Oh, we're working on.
And again, it's a decent proxy because if you're not, it's like maybe it's not the best, but if you're not basing it on something, then people are just doing finger painting or they're, like whatever. They're going to the movies
Music
and
therapy,
running
yeah.
your, Blue Cross Blue Shield and like whatever people will do.
What, I'm just saying, I've noticed in my many years of experience working both professionally and personally with addicts and alcoholics and just trauma treatment is it's not as linear. There's no, well, there's the bad guy and you're the good guy, or there's the victim and there's the perpetrator. It's just not that, it's not that simple.
Yeah.
It cannot be.
I've read a little Carl Jung, and he hear him talk about his practice. He
Mm-hmm.
had his theories, and he would wax philosophical, of course. But it seemed like for him, there was almost like this getting in the ring with someone. It was like sort of two souls meeting, and he would talk about transference and countertransference, right? Is we think about that as like I got countertransference, which means like my feelings kind of just got hurt because I don't like this person, and I had a reaction to them. But the idea that these can actually be a useful part of, if done properly, if the clinician is paying attention closely, this is all part of the chemical reaction that takes place in a therapeutic setting, which ultimately allows people to maybe fundamentally change.
Yeah, I mean, Carl Jung is, I went to a Jungian school. I went to Pacifica because I love everything Carl Jung related. And he was, and I'm a huge fan of 12-step recovery, and Carl Jung had a lot to do with that too, in helping Bill and Bob put the steps together, because at that time, they were looking for the best of the best in the business, saying, how do we deal with alcoholics? So we're getting nowhere. And the notion of psychic change and all of that really came from Carl Jung. And so Carl Jung is the guy that talks about there is no teacher here. There's no expert. If you walk into my office, I'm not some kind of expert that could tell you how to live life. I'm going to give you very specific directions. I don't know who you are. I've known you for the 10 minutes that you've been here, right? I don't know what's best for you. I don't know what it is that is like your path. What I do know is how to hold and like light up a lantern and hold it in front of me and walk with you. So I'm not so much telling you what the answers are. I'm just holding up a mirror and going, could it be this? Could it be
Like,
that?
I'm a guide to yourself.
Yes, I'm just the guide. But what's happened with modern therapy is we've become the experts. I now know what's good for your child far more than you ever could. You're just an ordinary average housewife. I have, training in child development. Or,
It's
or
crazy.
we've completely replaced mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and cousins or whoever that you would typically look at as like, I don't know what to do. Tell me what to
Yeah.
do. It's like, oh no, where'd you graduate from? You don't, I don't look up to you for any kind of answers. I'm going to go to the professional and have the professional then call my mom and teach them how it is that you need to be raising me.
That's crazy, because that just goes right to the state too, right? Because you have to get a license that's given by the state. So basically,
Goes deep.
it goes real deep, right? It's that whole thing. I think that was the biggest rejection of like the left in this last election, right? Not to get political, but it was a big, deep psychological rejection. Is that people don't want, the state to be your mom and dad. Some people do, right? That's to each their own. But for the most part, people want to keep their family within their own family unit. They don't want this therapist telling, that goes into a lot of other real hot topics that I don't know if we'll.
I've been thinking about just the basic, like the broad concepts of like dependence and independence, you know, and how much, what a strong influence that is. I mean, we are naturally interdependent optimally as humans. Like, you just put me on a desert island alone and I'm going to wither and die. But there can, and, you know, to have proper dependence, you know, what are we depending on? Nothing. Or to be overly dependent is certainly something that we're aware of. And something like the state, you can make an argument that this overdependence on the state creates like an infantilizing of the population, where they don't have the ability to develop their own dependence. But without the state and some regulating force, you know, then like who's the arbiter of quality, things like that. I mean, you're a libertarian, so you'd be like a radical.
Well, no, but it's funny because Aristotle said that we're political animals. That's what makes us different from other animals. There's this idea of politicalness to us, and that probably weaves into the dependency and non-dependency on each other, right? We have to make these laws and these regulations, and this is what you ought to do and what you ought not to do.
Yeah,
And
I mean, we're all extremely dependent on. The power went out an hour ago, and we're like, we got to postpone the podcast, you know, like. And we don't understand, we just take it for granted. And there's, you know, the financial system and, you know, laws, like just the legal code, like it's something that's just so deep and just has such a massive influence on all of our lives and our abilities to function or not function. So there's just this incredible amount of dependence, which is just necessary. But, you know, to become pathologically in an unhealthy way dependent can be, you know, really a terrible thing.
Which is what's promoted, you know, and I think especially with women, for instance, it's this, we've overcorrected. You know, 50 years ago, we were very limited and dependent on a man to pay for everything and all of that. And now the pendulum has swung way the other way, because now I can make a lot more money than you. I can do all things that you can do and better. So there's really no need for you to men, for instance.
And I can even have a penis. You can. No, I mean, you know.
I mean, I could.
Yeah, right.
But in terms of my personal experience, that's not my desire.
Yeah. Right, but I'm just saying.
But
it's
generally, the outlook of, like, what's your purpose here? I don't need you.
Right.
I could even go have my own kid.
Which has been great for women, or has it been?
It hasn't been.
Yeah, because of why?
Because look at the fucking relationships, the quality of the relationship life in terms of family and coupleship, and it's not just limited to men and women, just relational lives have completely deteriorated because, wait a minute, like, what's your role here? And then this notion of, you know, men used to be the ones that cheat and that would hide and that have mistresses that live somewhere they would visit on the weekends. Now it's completely the other way. Just about every female I know, has something going on in the background, and it's like, well, I deserve it. I had kids and I served the household, and now I could have a little bite if I want to.
Do you think we should just go back to when just only men can have mistresses? And
well, I think men were much more successful at it because biologically you're able, most, again, majority, not all, to have sexual relations and just go about your life and then continue to be an effective, loving husband and father and not think twice about it. Whereas women, we can't help it. As much as I think I'm this badass that can just hit it and quit it, that's not possible.
Right,
because
we're built different. Women can become more attached.
Well, physiologically, you release hormones that, you know, that really won't allow you to go on life and have it be in the background. Now it's a very significant part of your life because of the relationship you had. Whereas for the guy, for the most part, it's like, I stopped thinking about it the moment I left the apartment.
But you know what? There is a counter to that, though. I don't think, if you look at guys that do that, they don't have good lives, though. Right? Like, they're not having a wholesome marriage.
Yes.
Like, there's something that they're participating in, whether it's hedonism, whatever you want to call it, infidelity,
and obviously both,
and it hurts them.
Yeah.
Right. And it hurts the family.
No doubt.
Yeah.
That's 100%.
So yeah.
But it doesn't completely reorient their like internal world necessarily. It probably does. I mean, I'm sure it does sometimes. And maybe it'll catch up statistically less.
Yeah.
I think
Sure.
both men and women have an instinct to pair bond, and it's actually a beautiful thing about humans is that we do. You know, long-term mating is kind of the norm, and part of the way that happens is that, men fall in love with women that they're, that they have relations with. But maybe for women, it's more pronounced because there's a greater cost, right? Like in childbirth and raising a child, you become very vulnerable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the piece that we're really pushing against, which makes me really love Jordan Peterson's work, especially recently with how much he emphasizes. And the proof is in the pudding. Look at all the young, the primary fans of his that follow him are young men, because he's the first guy that says, oh my God, you remember how it used to be to like be a guy, to like have your girlfriend or your partner look at you for protection and kind of hold on to you and stand behind you. Like, remember what that was like? Nobody can remember that, because who the are you here, Greg, or whatever? I just come and go, and you don't even need to be here. I am my own protection. A lot of times the male population overall have been so demasculated in terms of not being needed. You're just not needed, not financially, not emotionally, not physically. If I want protection, I'll set up cameras. If I want finances, I'll get my own promotion. Like, you're literally a role here that serves no purpose.
You're a sperm bank.
So why do I even have that? But I don't even need that. I'll go to a sperm bank and get pregnant, and then not have to deal with another person's shenanigans.
Or I probably won't. And one of the big
or I won't just become a cat lady.
Like, yeah, I mean that's one of the
or just a successful
successful cat lady. One of the massive changes that have come along with this is just the plummeting birth rate, right? And like it's just so different from our parents and grandparents' eras that people were, women I think are optimally fertile at 25 years old. Now women are often waiting much longer and then not at all, or they wait till they're 35 and then they start thinking about it, and then IVF and freeze the eggs and rushing around, but you don't have a relationship, and
IVF kind of reminds me of this massive obsession we have with like the storage system, right? Where I have this life that involves children and a big home, but I just can't do that right now because I have too much to do, or I deserve to have fun, so let's not just throw in the towel. So I'm going to put away my eggs, and I'm going to put away all the furniture so I can be free and travel, and I can not have a kid, that I have to be responsible for. So, and this just came to me. I don't know. I just find it fascinating when it comes to storage. Like, no other country is like this. And I grew up in the Middle East, and I moved here since I was a kid. But every other corner, at least every half a mile or a mile, there's this massive storage system units, and they all look really nice and clean and well put together, and they're all full. And there's, why there's so many of them? Because they do really well. People put their shit in there and pay every month for years and years and years, because we have placed that fulfillment 10 years down the line. Like, I just can't have it right now because I deserve freedom. But when I get older and I'm not as youthful and I'm not as attractive or I'm not as blank, then I will take out the furniture and actually submit to stability. Then I will take out the eggs and play house and wife. But it just can't happen. So I want my cake and I want to eat it too.
Sure.
I want to have the life of a degenerate, just completely like, it, let's see what happens, who comes about, with the guarantee that I have the stability should I want to tap into it.
That's interesting because, I've been watching the Gospels with Jordan Peterson recently, right? And this idea, that's almost like what you're describing as a perversion of sacrifice. Because you, in one version of that, you could say all these storage, it's like you're sacrificing, you're putting, you're offering to God, right? Like you're doing this work and you're collecting this stuff and you're putting it, away for future. Like you're a squirrel storing nuts, right? But that's not really what's happening with storage, right? You're holding on to a life that is
it's the opposite of sacrifice.
Right. It's a perversion of sacrifice. I wonder
too.
what like a person like Jordan Peterson would say about that, because that's a very interesting point.
And the idea that stability is something that you can just defrost and like put in the oven and then you're good to go.
That's interesting.
Yes.
And that it's not actually built
that's
on.
a cool point.
That it's not built on everything that
Because I just know, we've all used storage, right? But like the proper use for me for storage was, you're going to buy a house, or you're going to go and move to a different condo, and maybe there's a lack between, you got to stay at your buddy's house for a couple of nights.
Yes.
So you rent a storage for, or one of those boxes that comes on your driveway. You put your stuff in there temporarily for a day or two or a week or a month, depending if you're buying a house. Contracts all close. You move in and you you're not using it, but there's this weird, you're right, they're on every corner.
They really are. And have you noticed?
There's reality TV shows about it.
About them. The minimalist.
Which are fascinating.
Wasn't it the documentary about the minimalists that really got into, like, why are we so obsessed with our storage units? And if you notice, they're so clean. They're immaculate. Green, these bright green and oranges, these very structured, very clean. You don't see a single stain on any of them. That's not a coincidence. That's like, I will keep it safe, like nothing ever happened. You come back in 10 years and it looks exactly the same unit with the same color, with the same everything. So you get to pause time and there's no consequences for that. Says who? Like, what? Like, who comes up with this stuff? And then we're just drinking the Kool-Aid, right? And not seeing that there's a cost for this. Same with masculinity piece. Like, if I continue to dismiss you as my, for instance, husband, and I continue to tell you how much I don't need you, you're here because I want you here. But really, you could be replaced, or I could have anybody here. Like, this is the kind of thing that I actually once lived in, personally, in terms of my complex relationship with what it's like to be independent versus what it's like to need. I was highly clingy, needy in my 20s, let's say, where I could not be without you. I couldn't sleep alone. I had to have somebody. I had to have you replaced before I moved on to the next relationship, right? I couldn't just leave the relationship because it wasn't working. You had to just be the warm body until I had your replacement, to my 30s, where I became kind of cut off and I don't need anybody. I can financially support myself. I can emotionally support myself. I have my girlfriends and my friends as like my intimate relational pieces that I need. And then I work and I make my own money. So there's really so
of those two, which one is better?
Well, neither was working.
And so what's the solution?
So the happy middle ground that I'm that Jordan Peterson, for instance, has really helped in that, and really learning what it's like to honor your piece, right? That there's no, needing doesn't mean weakness. Vulnerability is actually courage. Like Brene Brown's work is big on this. And that by admitting that I need, I'm really creating a sense of usefulness for you. And vice versa, because there are things that you can provide that I can't, and things that I can provide that you can't. And that's what makes the unity so effective. It's the real understanding and partnership of how we meet in between. And so I've really started to, and that's what I was saying with backing off and not being this very driven, and there's nothing wrong with that, but exploring my own psyche and getting into like what was coming from that was that I don't need you. I could do what I want, versus how that was, and how that affects men is no wonder they feel dismissed and they've become avoidant. And because we as women like me, most of my friends, are so effective, like hyper overly effective now, to where the guy looks around, it's like, oh my God, like she literally has no need for me. I don't even need you for sexual satisfaction. Like, we have literally designed our lives and so glorify this, I am an independent woman, to where the guy has no use and they feel completely without purpose and they serve no, it's like, what am I here for? So they just hide and shrink and shrink.
There's a term that I'm thinking of that gets thrown around in therapeutic circles a lot, which is like getting your needs met. I don't know if you use that type of, and I'm also work in, treatment environment. And, so there's a lot of this kind of feeling of like the way people act out is in an effort to try to get unmet needs satisfied, and that we don't have the tools to be able to identify what our needs are, to ask for them in a healthy way. And so, even later into adulthood, we're throwing fits because it's the only way we know how to get attention, and, et cetera. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. We have no real understanding what our needs are.
So part of the work is probably identification of a need. Like, there's just not any insight. At some stage, But there's a role confusion. Nobody knows what I'm here for. So, for instance, I knew mom was like the queen of the house. Whatever happens in the house,
mom decides what moves, what comes in, what goes out. I knew dad was kind of the breadwinner and kind of the shot caller and the front of this united front. You know, he would be the guy you talk to when you enter the home. Like older siblings, there was some form of hierarchy. There was my boss, there was my teacher that I wouldn't dare, you know, speak up to or try and challenge. Like there were roles, right? Yeah. Now it just seems like it's so
make up your own
convoluted because it's like if I get a call from my kid's teacher saying they're being disruptive and what's going on at home with them, I go, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You're just a basic teacher. I'm going to have this kid go see the top of the line psychologist, and then they're going to tell you that you don't know what you're talking about because my kid is brilliant and there's nothing wrong with them. And then the kid is going to then tell me how you're performing every day. The 8-year-old is going to come home and tell me how you treated them, how you taught them, or how you perform your job. And based on that, I will decide your effectiveness. Like, talk about backwards and, you know.
Yeah, and then like industrial period, pre-industrial period, there was this concept which was separate spheres, which we all understand, which is like men have their sphere and women have their sphere, and sort of separate, but not necessarily unequal. But women were the home and like religion. There was a certain kind of view of like a type of purity that existed in the women's sphere where men went out into the, you know, to the dirty, cutthroat world and worked and built and brought home.
Wait, who wrote all this?
I don't know who coined that.
I remember this.
I remember learning about it in school in a long time. But now that the idea seems antiquated, right? And it seems chauvinistic ultimately. It's like, because...
It's toxic.
It's because ultimately, historically, men have had more power and more entitlement. They've been entitled to more as a result of their position in the hierarchy, which is naturally oppressive to women. It's a glass ceiling. It's a limit on the type of privileges and freedoms that women can experience. And how do you correct for that without
overcorrecting?
Well, you know, it's funny. It's funny. We just watched Mary Poppins last night.
Yeah.
And in that story, you see like the dad is the captain of the bank industry, and he's like, all he talks about is the British Bank and how organized it is, and he's a general of the British Bank. And then, but the mom's coming in too, with this like, women need to vote, da 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 da. And that's all her. That's what she's all about. And meanwhile, the kids are falling apart, and they can't keep a nanny. You know, right? So the house is falling apart because it's almost like
nobody's running it.
Right.
It's
Nobody's.
a free-for-all.
Yeah. And the masculine is going on this like masculine supercharge, and the feminine is going on this feminine supercharge thing. And, you know, it's funny because no wonder now there's terms like toxic masculinity, right? Like, I think I mean, I have my opinions about it. I think it's a load of shit, but that's like a thing now. Like, it's like if a male in class acts out or is more aggressive, that word is being thrown around. Like, he needs to be more feminized. And that's kind of, that's true. Like, women do civilize men. We need that. Like, you know, we need that. But now it's being thrown around like it's like men are the evil patriarchy, yada, yada, yada. Fill in the blank.
But it's not limited to, for instance, just because I'm a female doesn't mean I should be soft and sweet and gentle. Right. And just because you're a male, you should be the opposite. That's, I don't agree with that. Because what about with same-sex marriages or relationships? Or some men are just more feminine and some women are more masculine. That we don't have to decide based on gender whose role is what. But there has to be the yin and the yang. Like, we have to meet each other based on some of the soft versus tough, which then in the middle makes something livable.
A union.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a happy medium. So I don't agree with just because I'm a woman. See, that's why I think Jordan Peterson, people really misunderstand him sometimes because he's like this advocate for men and masculinity. It's like, yes and no. What he says, what I understand him saying ultimately is this need for, like if you're, let's say, in a relationship with somebody who's softer, more gentle and tender versus you're this tough, blocked, guarded, you need what they have and they need what you have. And nobody needs to change because I'm a male, I should be tougher, and because I'm a female, I should cook more and be more gentle. You just be you, whatever that is, right? Because we are who we are based on our circumstances. Maybe my upbringing didn't allow for me to be gentle and soft and shy and cute and all of that. Like I have to toughen up. And maybe vice versa. Your upbringing, you know, you grew up in a way that didn't, you know, you didn't need to be as tough and as guarded and as, you know, rough around the edges. Like you were very nurtured and coddled maybe, right? But ultimately what he's saying is we have lost touch with the piece about needing the other, right? To need, to want, or to look for you as meet me somewhere is like the big no-no, is because if you are effective, then you don't need, right? If you need protection, like get some cameras and get some robots in place, not tell your partner, like I get afraid at night because I see shadows. Like that conversation is just not to be had. And so, you know what I'm saying? So I think the primitive or the primal pieces haven't changed. How we go about them has changed. And even with women, like what I was saying with the gyms, have you noticed how muscular women have gotten, right? Like when I used to work out, it used to be, a lot of times it used to be about being thin. And I'm not big on thin as much as I'm big on strong. Like forget about skinny, focus on strong. But then strength has gone, like you see men under these tiny twigs versus women that are super muscular. And then you can't really tell who's who. Like super muscled up, you know.
Now, do you think we're going to blend together eventually? Like, do you think that's inevitable though? Like, I mean, as far as we push against this whole thing, because the one counter to what you were saying is that like men just tend to be more aggressive and are more authoritarian in the family. That's just, you know, not all men, right? Obviously, like a man can be feminine and a woman can be masculine, right? Of course. But in the bell curve on the extremes, we are completely different, right? And that is the brick wall that everybody's trying to run past or run through or whatever, or change or whatever, you know, what we're seeing in society today. But is that inevitable? Like, are we going to be on some starship thing where we're all kind of looking the same and it's just, you just have different tackle between your legs?
I wonder if I mean, it seems like it's moved in that direction.
Like a futurism.
But the pendulum may swing again. It's probably
Right.
It is right now to a degree.
Right.
Yeah.
But I just, you know, because there's a lot of theories and philosophies out there that talk about that, right? That talk about how this is just an inevitable thing because gender is on a spectrum and all that, you know, philosophy that's out there. And that we can fight it all we want. But eventually, men and women are literally going to be pretty much the same thing.
They become the kind of the same thing as they get older. If you notice, like old men and old women look much more similar because of.
And I mean, we have way
issues.
more we have way more similarities than we have differences. We do. That is a fact, right? We are the same species, right? There's no real fundamental difference besides just the tackle and the DNA. But it's just, I'm wondering, like, are we fighting this fight? Is it the good fight or is it just, you know, bullshit?
Yeah.
I mean, you can really go down the rabbit hole.
It's a rabbit hole. I know.
With this stuff. I know I do.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to trauma.
Yeah, okay, let's do that.
And I was thinking about the idea of trauma as an injury, you know, the idea that there's maybe a bruise or a break and that it's going to heal. And if there's a psychological trauma, like, do you know, is there any theories or evidence behind an actual injury taking place, like in a physiological way that can be corrected, or is this all conceptual?
No, Bessel van der Kolk, Dr. van der Kolk, for instance, he's a Harvard researcher, author of The Body Keeps the Score. I actually did one of his trainings a couple months ago, which really refreshed some of the material, and he's just a G in terms of trauma. That's what he does, is trauma. He talked about, you know, his initial work started with war veterans and PTSD and really treating veterans. This was before, you know, your date canceled on you, so now you have PTSD days. This was like
Shell shock.
Yes.
Yeah.
Real shell shock.
What used to be called shell shock. You know,
yes.
These men coming back and completely lost and unable to get back to their relatively any normal way of life. And so what he was saying in this training was that when it comes to pain, let's say if I'm rejected or bullied, and I'm botching this, but the body releases, I think, 8 milligrams of opioids in terms of the pain, as it would for, like, if I just stubbed my toe badly. And so if I'm told I don't want you, get away from me, or something along the lines of like that really like hits you in the gut. You know, that sensation of I feel nauseous, or the sweaty palms, all of which are associated with opioid release, right? In the same way that if I were to take a like morphine or Vicodin or whatever, I would get very nauseous and ill and just kind of depleted. So a tiny hint of that is released in response to the pain, the psychological pain.
Mm-hmm.
And that's factual. So they have done, people like him, Joe Dispenza, for instance, in a different realm with meditation, Dr. Dispenza has done a lot of work in trying to measure what once was, like, we think the mind and body are connected, which is now factual. Like, there's an absolute impact on the physiological body as it relates to the type of thoughts that you're having. So which each thought, I'm releasing certain chemicals, good or bad, but that ultimately I get to entertain, and I'm choosing whatever type of thoughts that I want to entertain or choose to follow. With that, the body's changing.
Mm-hmm. So with someone who's experiencing a trauma response or has been traumatized, what's happening there? Is there a experience that's attached to a thought that is just unhealthy, that is exceeding its intended purpose?
It's involuntary a lot of times. Sometimes you can notice, this is reminding me of, you look like the guy that assaulted me when I was young, but a lot of times it's involuntary, and it's happening completely without your knowledge or consent. You have nothing to do with it. You're just a witness. And that's why, exposure therapy, for instance, was big at one point, where we're going to take you back to your trauma. We're going to take you back to the scene where the car accident happened, or back to wherever your childhood home that was burned down. And then we're going to, now that you're in this empowered, mature adult version with support, we're going to follow through and see, and you're going to come out and have a different narrative. Well, that's complete bullshit, and it doesn't work. All it does is completely paralyzes you with the same kind of fear, except now you're not 7 and you're having it as an adult with a therapist next to you.
It just makes it worse.
Well, JP does that though.
It has its intended purposes.
ERP?
It does. Exposure therapy.
Remember, that's the butcher. Like, he takes somebody
different.
that's
different than week after week. Let's go to like the details of how they grabbed you and locked you in the hole and raped and beat you and abused you. Like, what was going through your mind? And it's like, you can't help, even if it's 10, 20, 30 years past. As I talk about it, it becomes very much here now. The sensations, the memories, the smell, the sight, all of it. And I might cry or I might get angry. And it's like, okay, see you next week.
Just yesterday, I drove to the valley for something and went through Simi Valley over the Santa Susana Pass. And many, many years ago, I was driving on that road at night, and it was raining. And I was just behind a major accident that took place. Like, it had already taken place, but it was so recent that there was no emergency vehicles. And I slowed down, and I remember seeing a body laying on the freeway, just motionless with rain pouring on it. And I just kept driving. But I find it fascinating. Yesterday was a good example. Every time I drive on that road, I think about it. It doesn't. I don't have an emotional reaction to it necessarily.
But there's a physiological reaction.
But I remember it. I think about it. Think about how many times I'm driving down the road and I'm not paying attention to the signs or consciously making note of where I am because I'm just on some sort of automatic pilot and I'm thinking about my day or whatever. But every time I drive down the Santa Susana Pass, I take a second and I go like, oh yeah, here's the spot.
Isn't that fascinating though? And sometimes you have enough consciousness and awareness to kind of sit back and watch yourself going through it. It's like, damn, I can think the thoughts. There's enough space to where I can notice without becoming it.
But imagine if I was the person who was laying on the, on the pavement. Like, for me, I remember that involuntarily. But but there wasn't really any physical trauma or emotional trauma connected with it, except for maybe just, the kind of alarm that one might experience by seeing that. But to have been in, I've been in car accidents as well. but that thought is completely involuntary. Something reminds me of it, and I don't have any agency to say like I want that thought or I don't. It just comes. And if attached to that thought is like a refeeling of all of these things that is then informing my perspective. Now I'm seeing danger where there isn't danger because of the way my body is reacting to a thought that's occurring to me because I'm reminded of something and have no agency over whether or not I was reminded of it. And, I can imagine how difficult it would be to correct all of that. And so as a trauma specialist, that's your job. How do you do it?
And correct is really the right word, because a lot of times what you would hear is, how do you work on that? Everybody is working on their trauma. I'm working on my anxiety. I'm working on my depression. I'm working on it. I can't go out here because it causes my general anxiety gets out of hand, or I can't do this because my bipolar, it triggers me. If I could die tomorrow with ever hearing the word trigger, what's the other one? Trauma maybe, but the T's.
No, trigger, yeah.
Trigger is definitely one of them. There's another one. This constant, everybody and their mother and their pets are triggered constantly. It's just life is this one big trigger. And I think, and that was one of the indication that I was like, I need to back up a little bit, because I'm starting to despise all clinical terms. Trigger being one of them.
Is that a clinical term now? Triggered?
Probably not technically.
Not technically, but it's always
used.
been.
It's used a lot. Yeah.
But what you're saying is, it reminds me of a client I worked with years ago who was in a car accident, and the cart was, upside down, and she still had the seat belt on, and there started to be some fire, so she was unconscious, but she could hear the workers or whoever that came around saying like, the car is about to blow up. We need to get out of here. And she's hearing this as she's tied in the car. Mm-hmm. And ultimately she, got out and was safe. But this years of can't drive, can't be anywhere near a road, can't be anywhere near a fire, or very startled by any, just unexpected noise. And so she had this therapist that was so hyper protective of her, almost to a point where it was maybe not illegal, but unethical. She was just, are you okay? So when she came to me, the therapist had recommended that she sees me, but the therapist was like, I need to be in that session. It's like, that's weird. For what? Why would you need to be in the session, the therapist with the therapist, because she had taken on this woman, this elderly woman, as like enmeshed, hyper sort of involved, over the top with, she's so fragile. I need to be in there to like make sure that you get like the background and what she's struggling with. It's like she can't talk, what?
She's just enabling
But
her.
right there, I could see how you're the piece that has her stay limited and sick. That's why.
Something that we see so much is, parents, maybe unconsciously not wanting children to become independent because there's a need being met by having someone who's dependent on you.
Yeah.
And how it takes an incredible amount of maturity to, to allow yourself to not be needed anymore for the betterment of someone else.
And that's the role confusion piece. Again, it's when, instead of gaining a sense of intimacy with my wife or husband or spouse or partner, I am now besties with like my 17-year-old son. And I take him and his friends all to outings, and we have this great relationship where he confides in me, I confide in him. It's like the guy is just like, what you have no real purpose here, because...
I remember I was reading some psychoanalytic paper, and, like Freud gets a bad rap for sexualizing everything. Mm-hmm. I think he conceived of the sexual sphere as being just beyond like penis and vagina. Like it was more of things that were pleasure-oriented. And he obviously had a broader kind of lens for that. But I was reading about this this claim that a form of sexual abuse, this is going to sound bold, but a form of sexual abuse in a partnership or in a family could be like, say, mother gets really close with her son, and she does it to avoid her relationship with her husband.
Absolutely.
And that, they were making the claim that that's a form of sexual abuse.
Emotional, incestuous relationship. Yeah, incestual.
Emotionally incestual.
Emotionally incestuous.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Okay.
Is
that a actual...
That's exactly what I was, that goes back to what it was literally. or the...
Is that a term that's used technically?
It is.
Yeah.
Not as much as it should be.
Yeah, we don't want to. I wonder why.
It's like, oh no, I'm a loving mom.
Oh.
But and you could see this with family therapy where you really need maybe 20 half hour to really see like what's at the core of the relational issues with the family, because who's doing the most talking, who's kind of leaning forward, what happens when the daughter starts to complain about how terrible mom is, and then he jumps in and is like, yeah, I was there, she shouldn't be treating that, right? It's like almost like a couple's relationship.
Yeah, it was fascinating. We had a family come in recently, and it was mother, father, and son. Son was being admitted into treatment, and they were all kind of touring and meeting, and they at different times had to like go out to use the bathroom or make a call. And each time some person would leave, you'd have a whole new dynamic, you know?
Isn't that
and there'd be a
cool?
lot of like talking about and a change of relating to each other, and then they would come back and then they'd switch, and then one would leave, and then here we'd have a new thing, which is normal to an extent, I imagine. Like we all have unique relationships and operate in them in a way that's unique to that particular, you know, dynamic. But at some point,
That's so true.
Yeah.
And I don't do a lot of family therapy because it's a sort of specialty that I was not necessarily drawn into, like people whose primary focus is family, for instance. But a lot of times the family is not the issue. The fact that you don't know who your husband or wife is, or your partnership, like your sexual intimate partnership, has been lost by your over obsession with your teenage son's addiction, for instance. So you're not here for the wife or husband. You're here, and your entire nervous system and psyche is devoted to where is he at, what is he doing, is he safe? And so that's why, for instance, in recovery, and you see this all the time, Chris, is when the identified patient gets better, for instance.
yeah.
And it's like, well, as long as, you know, all we want is for him or her to be clean and sober and happy and address their mental health, and then the family would be
again.
fine. But as soon as they get better, the family falls apart.
Yeah.
Because you, the sick person with your addiction or with your mental health, have been the primary cause of all of our family issues all these years. But now there's this giant gap of space that we don't know what to do with.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like I make music periodically, and like right now I'm in the middle of making a piece. And for me, the creative endeavor is one that, you know, people say that must be so wonderful, but it's actually kind of like harrowing.
Chaos.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
have to like
yeah.
go into just the unknown, and it's difficult at different times, and so I can get a certain, you know, I can get.
That's probably why your hair's longer, huh?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. But getting to that point where I know like I need to get back in there and continue to create, but I will start like cleaning my apartment, you know, like, which is something I would never normally do. Like I don't want to clean my apartment, but sometimes a more daunting task will make cleaning the apartment like a welcomed distraction.
Kind of like the cold plunge.
And
you
so
know?
rather than
Yeah.
diving into the relationship,
Right.
like it's just I can go into my son who needs help, and
Right.
what are we going to
Oh,
do,
yeah.
and
It's
let's call some
Oh, that's
therapists.
such
And
a good distinction. Yes, because that's one is a lot more doable, and I can feel effective and useful right now, and I can hide behind it. I haven't been interested in my partner for years, and this is really great now because it gives me a sense of purpose, and it has me not deal with the giant elephant in the room, which is our complete disconnection. And that's why a lot of family issues is really not about the problem child or the problem, whoever the problem is. Like, that's why we're here. It's really not about them. It's about the people that brought them. Almost always. Typically, like an authoritative figure, like a mom and a dad, usually, right? Whoever is making the shot, who's the shot caller in terms of like, you better go to this or else. I mean, you saw that with your friend's, you know, son. The guy that the hairstylist guy whose kid was referred to you, which then to me. Anyway, there was a kid that was.
Oh yeah. That's right.
You know, you
That's right.
see that as dysfunctional.
It's the family. Yeah, they're
and
the
as-
more dysfunction.
Oh my
it's the mom
God.
and the dad. it's the hungry mother. What
Devouring mother.
The
Devouring mother.
Yeah, and that's
the
a
hungry
Buddhist
ghost.
term. Yeah, the hungry ghost. That's another one, right? Or is that
Well,
the
they're
same?
different. I think devouring ghost is like a Buddhist thing with this. It's an imagery of a ghost with a huge belly and a small mouth. And
Never
it can
enough.
Never
Right,
enough. It's
right,
like
right.
craving and
Yeah.
unsatisfiable mind.
Yes.
The devouring mother is, I think, more of like an archetype, which
Right.
is the idea of like a caring mother. When it goes
Over-caring.
when it goes over, then the caring becomes like a devouring out of a need
Yeah.
for the dependency that.
But the
has.
kid was portraying the symptoms in terms of not leaving, not being effective, not being functional. But the root problem was not the kid; it was the parents,
Now there's this-
particularly the mom.
Well, you know what's funny is I had that experience recently with a guy that I've worked with for years, and you worked with him too. And I'm not going to name him on here, but he had to go make an amends, right, which is part of a recovery group, right? And this amends could have gotten him in a lot of trouble, right? Like he could have gone to jail technically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he stole some stuff from a department store, and so I directed him, hey, you got to go do this. You got to go there with cash in hand, the amount you stole, and that's it, right? Like go make that amends, right? And I think like an hour before it was supposed to happen, I get a call from the guy's mom, and I was like, wow. This is where the problem, like this is the relationship between the two, or that's the problem.
And why was mom calling you?
Because she was afraid that her son was going to go to jail for making this amends.
Trying to make you
Right, trying to kind of change this whole
to protect
thing.
him when
And
really
then,
him doing
and
that
I had to
was-
explain to her that like this is on a different plane of why your son has to do this. This is not the laws of the earth. This is like God's laws, right? And I sound like a stupid sage with a weird beard, but it all worked out. And I had to concede that I would go there with him as like his backup, which is, that's totally okay. It's like going there with your
Yeah.
therapist, right? And it, long story short, the amends was made and it was fantastic, right? Like the department store told the guy, hey, come back and shop anytime you want. Like you're welcome here. Thank you so much. Da 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 da. It's all water underneath the bridge, right? And they didn't even require him to pay the money back.
Yeah.
And I've seen that countless and countless times, but you can see like the root problem is that relationship.
Her instinct to protect
Yes.
is overbearing,
is
and
harming.
it's gonna hold him back
Yeah.
Right.
for later development.
There's an idea in recovery circles, which is like it wasn't my upbringing that made me an addict or an alcoholic, right? Because it seems like it's kind of in bad faith to blame your problems on your parents and to say I'm here because X, Y, and Z. And so the prevailing thought is, no, alcoholic and addict is something very separate from my upbringing. I may have been brought up great. I may have been brought up poorly. But that is not the determining factor. What do you think about that?
Well, the blame, the key word being blame.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where we go wrong. And that's where I think therapy.
But if we take blame out and we turn it into what, influenced.
Blame is the story, though, that we're all writing.
Yeah.
This is why I am this way.
But it seems like aside from the damage of holding that blame and operating by it, it seems like kind of bullshit. Like there's what we're talking about here, the influence of a parenting structure on it's kind of like you talked about trauma. All addicts have trauma, but not all traumatized people become addicts.
Right.
You also, it's like neurotics. All alcoholics are neurotics, but not all neurotics are alcoholics.
Right.
Well, could you also say all addicts and alcoholics have childhood, developmental, parental issues, but not everyone that has those issues becomes an alcoholic or an addict?
Well, I think that stems from the people not wanting to. Because I believe in the recovery circles, it's all about personal responsibility, right? And that's probably where that idea kind of comes from. And maybe it's a little perverted there, that you just want to blame, right? Or you don't want to blame, right? That's what you're saying. But really, you don't, because you have to. Mom and dad might be dead. The family might be disappeared. And you still have to do your work and build your relationship with a higher power and all that. So you can't just be sitting there in the past. We don't shut the door on the past, but we still look at it, but we don't.
It comes to, like, I think about mom and dad again. Like, I know it's there's there's a group called ACA, familiar with?
Yeah.
Adult Children of Alcoholics.
Oh, yeah. That was like a 70s, 80s group.
No,
right?
it's not.
Oh, it's
alive and well.
Yeah.
And
Oh my God.
yeah.
Now it's moved towards adult children of dysfunctional families.
Okay. You know, but
Is that what it's called?
Yeah, but there's also, so within 12-step groups, there's Al-Anon.
Right.
Right? Another one that isn't as prevalent in this area, but in Los Angeles it was more prevalent, was SLAW.
Yeah.
Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. But it's not uncommon for people that are in Alcoholics Anonymous or a primary
Right.
12-step group to at some point seek out some of these other 12-step groups that have a different way of looking at things. And when you think about adult children of alcoholics, a lot of that is coming to terms with and understanding how your upbringing, you know, it's because I think there's another thing we can do. I suffer from this probably, is that, you know, I grew up with an alcoholic mom and I idealize her. Like, she was fantastic. She was a wonderful mother, you know, and I think there is evidence behind people's ability to do that, to defend their, you know.
But the fact is, she wasn't.
She was,
Yeah. Right.
Again, like, I'm like, don't say that about my mom. Yeah. But she, you know, for a period of years when I was growing up, she was severely alcoholic, and so she wasn't present, and so she was unavailable. You know, but in my head, I'm like, she was an angel. She's the best mom anyone could ever ask for. You
Yeah.
know, she's a saint, really, to me. You know, but this idea of actually, you know, so there's kind of a denial that can take place in just, it's all my fault. You know, it's like, it's all responsibility without any awareness into what influences could have contributed to the situation you're
Yeah.
in. Seems like it could cut both ways.
Yeah, no, it definitely.
And that's why I
can.
think some people will hold these different fellowships at once, because one is kind of mom, which is like understanding, right? Like, let's understand where you came from. Like, that makes sense why your feelings are hurt, sweetie. Like, that was hard. And
But rather than demonizing the source, be it mom or dad or whoever, the perpetrator, right? You go back to the sensation, not what happened, but what has it done to me and how does it affect my life today? Because we get caught up in the story so much. Therapy has we do a lot of talking, a lot of outward, like week after week, month, years after years. We talk about what happened, how it affected me, but we're not going inward enough. We're not going like, where was I responsible in terms of using this story as a way to stay small, to play small?
But how do you do that work aside from talking about it?
Well, talking is important. The problem isn't that we talk. The problem is that we don't stop talking, right? We're staying in the talking and not moving past the talking, right? The story hasn't changed, except I keep picking it apart to death.
And I think that's one of the ways that therapy can backfire, right? Is that we start to kind of make an effigy out of our problems, and we just talk about them
pathologizing it
so
right?
much that they become hyper fixated on. And maybe the idea is just, it's like the old pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, whatever happened to Gary Cooper, you know, the strong silent type who just, you know, it's just like, you just go to work. And rather than like get in the therapist's office and talk to your wife for 12 hours about the way that, you know, that went and how, everything's going. And like, you know, there's just like, you can't get bogged down by all of those things anymore. We just like there's only so much time to like uncover every pea in the mattress. At some point, we just have to like get out there and live our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Who's that famous philosopher that said, at some point philosophy needs to die?
Who?
I think it was Foucault.
Was it?
Actually, yeah. There's one of these famous ones. It's a very profound statement. It's like at a certain point,
Philosophy's like that too.
Yeah,
It's like
you
therapy
just-
that you just
keep going and going and going and going and going until.
which is why Nietzsche's so great, because he just will
Yeah.
go. You know, he will contradict himself. You know,
Right.
and just,
Endlessly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's the over-identification with the process, hence the diagnosis. And going back to the DSM, for instance, we're so over-identified with my trauma or my diagnosis. So if I ask you, like, hi, you know, I'm whatever, introducing yourself, you'll find that a lot of times one of the first few sentences people, I'm an incest survivor.
Yeah.
I have BPD, I have borderline,
It's
I
kind
have
of
anxiety.
become a
It's
trope, like a liberal criticism
there are
of just
so
someone
many
who will.
other aspects of yourself that you could lead with.
That leads me to a
and
good
that's
question.
what you picked.
Oh, here he goes.
So is it a therapist's job to affirm? somebody's
Oh, no.
sickness. Because
I knew it was going to come up somehow.
Right,
Are they technically like?
But really, like, are you
But
supposed
it is, because you need the therapist backing you up in order to qualify
for benefits
for the next step.
So
and
they're-
insurance too, though, isn't it? Because I feel like
They're the qualified party.
And if you
Isn't
don't,
that a problem,
and if you
though?
have a problem with that, you can't renew your license. If you say, "Well, I don't agree with this,"
You can't opt out and say, I don't want to be the person who's
No.
deciding
Affirming.
this. It's my
No.
responsibility. If I'm going to be licensed, I have to accept
well, not
it.
deliberately. You can try and avoid clients with those kind of issues, or you can kind of get away with it, but you can't. Basically, if I don't agree with that being even an issue or being something that I agree with, then you can't continue being a therapist, which is what kind of they did with Jordan Peterson, where
Yeah.
they took his license and all of that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
from Canada did, right? But I just feel like that is probably the death of therapy, actually, would be requiring a therapist that they have to affirm in order for somebody
Or
to
even,
qualify
or even
for
to not
benefits.
affirm.
Well,
the
it's
fact
a-
that it becomes
but-
their job.
Yeah.
But it's the death of parents or any kind of authoritative figure. It's the death
Right.
of employment where I can't come because I'm triggered today. So like I
Or
can't
I have
come to
time.
work.
I have what's that newer one? That's really I have like time amnesia or whatever, where you can't associate to time.
Oh my
So
God.
it's your cop out for being late.
It's your cop out for
Yes.
It's like an ADHD thing, right? Time blindness. Or,
Oh, yeah.
time blindness. That's
Yeah.
what it's called. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's linked to ADHD.
Yeah.
Of course, but like that's the thing. How the hell can therapists operate in this modern way
Now, here's
with
a
the DSM so big now?
Here's a funny observation, which is how the culture has changed. You were mentioning how a therapist used to be referred to, or a psychologist or psychiatrist, as a quack.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a certain stigma around seeing someone like that.
Right.
And
Especially with men, though, probably I would
Yeah.
say primarily, right?
Yeah, yes.
Right.
And this idea of not talking about your feelings, not you don't want to be seen as having trauma because it's a vulnerability and it's a weakness that can be exploited by others, and it signals that you're not a strong person who's as capable.
You're a weak bitch, basically.
Basically a weak bitch.
Yeah.
And now there's been this shift, which has been like the trauma Olympics, right? It's who's got the greater trauma, who's got who's got more diagnoses.
Oh yeah,
Why-
who's on more meds?
But the only way that could have happened is that it's like a will to power thing, right? That something has changed at a cultural level so that it's considered to be of a greater advantage to have more ailments, more diagnoses,
Yeah.
more weaknesses, more vulnerabilities.
It's the victim
Than not.
Victimhood has
Yes.
become
It creates-
the
it's-
meekness of
it's a
have
s-
inherited the earth.
How does
What do you
how
say?
does status come from vulnerability and weakness?
Because it's the oppressor versus the oppressed.
It's probably like a intersectional thing, right? Like the whole thing gets flipped over. So the more the deck is stacked against you, like the more privileges that you should be given.
Right. The more you've been oppressed too.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't have these illnesses if the world wasn't so oppressive and horrible and filled with all these monsters.
But ultimately, the external consequences or the external impact, be it your mom and dad or society or whatever, something basically outside of me that is the cause of why I can't thrive in the ways that I think I should or I see somebody else doing. Right? And so it's the overemphasis on diagnosing and the story rather than self-responsibility and really moving past it so we don't regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it, but we will see how our experience can benefit others. It's like, well, fuck others. I'm here to talk about my trauma. I'm not here to talk about how this is going to help me be a more effective human being that could potentially make a huge impact as a result of having gone through something so horrific. It's like, oh no, that's not what I'm paying you for. I'm paying you to tell me how terrible it was and provide me with some tissues so we can cry for the next hour and then do that again next week. And so the thing that really threw me off was similar in that I think the last message from my supervisor I got before I was like, I'm out, this is just not going to work for me, was a kid that kept coming back 5 or 6 times. And, he had a pretty good policy, which really goes back to like the piece about keeping them there. And he wasn't getting better. He had no interest in being there. It was very obvious. Zero engagement, zero interest in treatment whatsoever. And he's sleeping all day, and there was a text message, like, what are we supposed to do? The text being like, what, do I wake them up? I don't know. He's disastrous. I can't even approach him. And the supervisor kind of going like, just let him be. We don't want to poke the bear. Literally the words, don't poke the bear. It's like, what? The F has happened.
It's like smoke
to
that
our
bear out.
That's your
line
job.
of
Is to
work.
poke the
Get
bear.
this
So you
little fuck
doing.
out of bed and throw him in the pool.
That's
And
a
I'll
huge.
tell you
that's
who.
a much bigger topic, which we, is just. I think about that, like the professionalization of treatment and the money interest in it. It's complicated. Like, I don't know. I can't imagine how it could exist differently in a society that's capitalistic, which I'm a fan of, but ultimately we do work because we get paid for it. But when we're doing work like that and we're getting paid for it, it inevitably leads to, a dependence on the patients staying sick in order to fulfill our needs of paying our bills.
And keeping the place open and the lights on and all of that.
Whether we have to work against it, identify our biases, do whatever we can do, but ultimately, even at an unconscious level, there's going to be, even for the most, righteous of us, some sort of incentive for us to keep people in a place where they're dependent on us. Because when they're dependent on us, then our needs get met.
Well, it just brings me back to the affirming question, right? Because like the one thing I've understood from Jung, the little I've read of him, is that you're not permanently this defect. Like if you come in with some problem, right, you're not permanently that. Like you can evolve, you can change. Like just because I suffer from manic or what's a good one, like depressive disorder, major depressive disorder, doesn't mean that I'm going to be 65 with major depressive disorder, right? I might be more likely to have it based around my environment, but if I actually like work through this, it's going to go away and I'm going to be usefully whole.
But that's the problem with diagnosis is that it's a life sentence.
Right.
So once I've been diagnosed with generalized
You
anxiety
can't.
or any of them, that's who I am now. That's what I have forever.
You can't
It's
get
kind
it
of
expunged.
It's kind of like cancer where, I can treat it and it could be in remission.
you're a cancer
but I'm never
survivor.
cure.
Yeah.
I'm always going to be bipolar.
Which
or
is
borderline.
alcoholism. Guess
In a
what?
way.
And we look at that in a favorable, right?
It is.
That's
kind
a
of,
good, that's
an interesting kind of.
And so some people that would be
paradox.
critics of Alcoholics Anonymous would say...
There's a lot, too.
Yeah, would say, what are you doing? Like, you're just reaffirming your illness. Why don't you try to grow out of it?
A lot of the Buddhist guys that I've come, shoulder to shoulder with think like, you're not a defect.
Some of those people will be like...
Right? Like you've transcended it, basically. There's a transcendence that's happened with you and God.
Yeah.
And so you don't need all this bullshit anymore. You don't need to go to these cult meetings and talk about how horrible you are, because like what happens in most 12-step recovery or it doesn't matter. I'm not talking specifically about one, but you identify. You identify right up. I'm JD and I'm an addict, or I'm JD, I'm an alcoholic.
Couldn't be more closely
right.
Like you are that.
That's it.
That's the only thing that matters there.
Right.
Well, we stick with the similarities rather than the differences, because remember Judy, a friend of ours, was so big on like, I don't identify as I'm an alcoholic. I identify as I'm Judy and I have alcoholism.
Yeah,
it's like, okay, whatever.
I know. It's like,
It's just
get
like
over
take-
yourself, lady, right?
But we love you, Judy.
We do love you.
Yeah.
But
we all
no,
know
that's
her,
the
yeah.
reaction. I mean, you can
Right,
can get why someone would do something like that,
Right.
because that is a good argument, which is
It
like, why am
is.
I going to keep reaffirming
But
this?
for her, that made sense because it was
But
like,
then you're
whatever
like,
though.
it's like
But
the
we got
tall
bigger
daisy thing.
issues.
You're
Like
just
your
trying
life
to-
is falling apart, and you're trying to like, do I have alcoholism or am I an alcoholic? It's like whatever. Like your life is a complete mess.
Well, maybe that's probably why most 12-step recovery, like fundamental 12-step recovery, not these offshoots, work so well, is because it's self-identifying. It's not. But is that then you can just self-identify as like, I have anxiety disorder or bipolar personality disorder.
Or it's like it's a self-diagnosing.
Right. There's
Yeah.
not like when I had to get sober, everybody in my circles that I interacted with were like, yeah, you are a drug addict.
Yeah.
Like your full flight from reality is psycho.
But it didn't matter until...
But at
But it
that
didn't
time you were. This is 20 years ago.
Right.
You couldn't behave in those ways. I know I couldn't behave in any of the ways that I did back then. Today, even
Right.
at my drunkest of drunk, I couldn't be in the same way irresponsible or self-destructive. So when we identify as an alcoholic or an addict within the context of the meeting, that's the only place I say I'm an alcoholic. Once
Right.
I leave and I'm at
Interesting.
Starbucks, I don't
not
say, hey,
identifying.
what's your name? I'm sure I'm an alcoholic. You know,
Right,
I don't
and
identify,
even
right?
to this, like, we're not supposed to talk about
Outside of-
outside
right.
of the groups, right? Like that's a part of the tradition.
But that's what you're saying is, you know, certain perspectives would tell you don't identify, like that's not, you could put it in the past and transcend. Yes
Right.
and no, in that if I'm in my therapist office or if I'm in my physician's office, I might talk about, you know, that the acid reflux or whatever the issue is. But that's not who I am. It's that in that realm, this is relevant. And the next time I see you, you're probably going to ask me about it. I'm going to tell you if it's good or bad or whatever. Same with alcoholism. Same with therapy. Like if I'm in a therapist office, a traumatic event is very much important to talk about. But if I'm on a date, let's say, and you don't know me, I'm like, yeah, you know, the first 10, 15 minutes
me of,
Trauma
before
dumping.
we even,
Remember
before
Blades
we
of
even
Glory?
order food, I'm telling you about my sex addiction and how I'm I'm a sex addict. Yeah, sorry. I just think we should be honest. Like, put it all out there. It's like, that's not honesty. And that goes back to the other piece with, like, we have confused vulnerability, like true vulnerability, with oversharing. Brene Brown gets into this too, in terms of, she says, like, you think you're being vulnerable because you shared about your recent, like, waxing experience. Like, that's not what vulnerability is. And that we have taken oversharing, like, you know, I'm just going to take a camera and take you in the depths of my life because I'm willing to be vulnerable.
Use that to avoid,
and
actually.
seen. It's like, that's not being seen. You know, the seen part comes after you have resolved some of the conflict and there's understanding, not when you're, you know, 2 8-year-olds going at it, like in the insanity. Nobody needs to see that. But it's the understanding and the resolving afterwards part. That's like the real, am I willing to be seen? Am I willing to be perceived as this person? Am I willing to expose what really happened and say, yeah, that was insane. Like, you saw that recently. Like, that was utter insanity. And as much as my ego was hurting in, like, the shattering of this image, that's very important for me to uphold. This person that's so, you know, intact and in charge and contained, right? If anything really fell apart, was the ego piece there. It's like, oh my God, it's almost like I've been seen and there's no not seeing it now. There's no going back ever. And then when you're drinking or drugging, it's like, yeah, I was drunk. I don't, you know, there's like, I had nothing to do with that. But when you're stone cold sober and behave in ways that you don't approve of is particularly, like, painful to the ego, because we work so hard in obtaining a mature, responsible character that might unravel in appropriate settings. But when you lose control in more of a public or, you know, unexpected ways, it's such a shameful sort of, like,
Well, embarrassment is one of the most painful emotions.
Yeah, goes back to the rejection.
Well,
Which
look,
can be-
the
for-
look. You know?
Yeah, and they can be long lasting. Like I have like some small embarrassments from years and years ago that have plagued me. You know, I know rationally that they're just like they're insignificant, but again, almost like the guy laying on the road. It's just you know, I always think about that and go like, dude, what an idiot. You know, like, why did you say that or do that?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I have very recent material, so for me, it's like it's like really here.
Well, I think of the look too, like, because that's a postmodern philosophy from Jean-Paul Sartre, and he writes about basically, like, this idea that when you're in a public, like, you walk into a park. I read this years ago, but you walk into a park, and you're totally subjective to the park, basically, but then as soon as there's a person across from there and they gaze on you, you're objectified. And I think that's an engine that's informing a lot of this kind of new stuff, right? That we're seeing, that's screwing culture up quite a bit, because now me just staring at you or saying a word about you is violence towards
That
you.
is funny.
Right.
How it changes things. Even you imagine like I play the piano, and if I were to play a piece for JD, it's a whole different experience.
Right.
You know, all of a sudden he's there and he's watching,
and
or
I'm
the cameras are
objectifying
on.
you. I'm objectifying you.
Yeah.
Like you're an object now.
technically.
Yeah, and you're feeling that objectification.
Yeah.
You know, and you're feeling othered. That's where the other thing comes from. And
Yeah.
it's all from John Paul Sartre.
And think about in this modern society where with social media, with internet, with cameras, you know, the amount of exposure that we are, you know, potentially subject to at all times and how that could influence us. So trauma, how do you fix it?
Sorry, I went a little.
Yes.
What actual work do you do?
So it's the
make it better?
integration of trauma. That's really the name of the game.
And what does
It's
that mean?
not, you know, I can't go back and change what happened, but I can change the narrative around what happened.
So
How?
there's an
By just-
acceptance piece.
is it
Do
just
they ever accept it first?
Not so much acceptance, but
Reframing?
an understanding, reframing, and telling a different story. There's a million different ways to describe
And you help
the
them,
same.
or is it like, why don't you think about it like this, Susie? And just keep trying to find a different frame for them that they can...
that fits and is more in alignment with where I want to be, right? If victimization is the piece, then I tell the story in a certain way. If I want to really get past this, then I might seek different treatments. For instance, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing is a big one with, rather than staying in the story, resolve it and really get past it.
So how does EMDR
so that
work?
you can look at it's reprocessing the memories. I can't get rid of them, but I can look at the same, for instance, little girl, boy in the disaster, and I can go, I see it, and I see how powerless I was, and I see how I couldn't do anything, and I understand the limitations of my environment, rather than how dare they leave me there, right? And both are very true, except which one do I want to go with? Which one is more productive in terms of the kind of life that I want to lead? So, and then mobilizing. So for instance, it makes me think of 9/11. So when 9/11 happened, you know, a lot of people from a distance are seeing these buildings crumble, and, you know, they would start running. They all started running the other direction. So the post-traumatic stress disorder in response to 9/11 was like very low in a way that really stood out. Like, this is a horrific terrorist attack. How come people aren't falling apart as much as you would expect in comparison to other similar events? And because they weren't tied down to they weren't stuck. They weren't confined. They saw the danger and they were able to move, physically move. And so there was no one to blame, including self. No one was at fault. And yes, later you can find out who it was and what happened and maybe have a special kind of hate for Muslims or for whatever, but it's not personalized, right? Whereas being abused or natural disasters or like I was saying, being confined and stuck, that's where the nervous system, the trauma is trapped.
That feeling of powerlessness.
It's trapped. So when 20 years later, you're in a confined space and you start hyperventilating and losing control, it's like, what is happening? I signed up to be here, for instance. Why am I panicking? It's because I've left the building and I'm back to 7 and my nervous system is going, this is familiar. You know, this inability to move. The last time I was in a similar space, my life was threatened. So then the responses are, you know, accordingly.
Do you practice EMDR or no?
I do.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I'm
you're
an
certified
EMDR
then.
therapist. Yeah.
Okay.
How much of the work you do is EMDR?
Not as much because the pandemic, so we had to do a lot of virtual, and then it kind of slowed down.
Could you give a percentage?
Probably I do like maybe 40% now of EMDR.
40% of the work you're...
Yeah,
like
of
your
EMDR, some
sessions?
form of EMDR. So it's not always tapping or eye movement, which is essentially EMDR is the bilateral stimulation.
Yeah.
Left brain, right brain. And so I do a lot of EMDR without necessarily doing EMDR. So it's a lot of like the narrative work and the storytelling piece and the safety, going back to the sensation, really readjusting your nervous system by yoga, theater, movement, all kinds of other things. EMDR is not as popular because it works.
Yeah. Can you how does it work?
Because it works in terms of you heal. So there's not this reoccurring, let's talk about what happened. Typically 4 to 8 sessions, maybe 10 tops. And there's a distinct, like, I can look at this horrific event that used to just the thought of it made me just fall apart. Now I can talk about it, but stay contained, stay intact, and then go about my life after. And that's why it's not popular, is because it works. And so it's not as popular with insurance companies, with therapists. You know, I would rather have you come back and tell me about it for the next 8 years rather than, 3 to 6 months. And you're now going, like, you've served your purpose as the therapist. I'm now going to go move on. And if I need to talk to somebody, I have a friend or a partner rather than
so
I'm
you're a
going to
big
pay
believer.
you and hold you hostage for an hour.
So, but like, so I kind of know a little bit about, so it's like there's this left to right tick that goes back and forth, or light.
And that's the other thing. They don't know exactly how, right? So they can't pinpoint it, which is why it's not as popular, because, you can't explain it specifically. And that's why insurance companies...
You either follow a light back and forth,
right,
or you hold these things in your hands,
right,
that they alternate.
Tapping.
But first, there's a whole process of identifying, right? You
You target a memory.
Target a memory.
So first you target a memory, and then you have this apparatus.
Go to that, and then I think you just sit there quietly, right? There's a whole thing where
there's not a lot of talking, which is why I love EMDR.
And
we're not
think about that memory, and then you just
you're in the sensation.
It's like
okay. It's
got to be kind of related to hypnosis, probably, right?
It's very similar.
And hypnosis has a bad rap, but
right, as does EMDR in a way.
Yeah.
Right. We deem it as very helpful for instance, like severe trauma, like the vets and all of that. But for everyday people with special kinds of trauma, it doesn't work. So it's bilateral stimulation, left brain, right brain. You don't know exactly what's happening, but you do know that there's a connection occurring that you can't get to with talking. And so there's sensation. So every 20, 30 times of back and forth, you would pause and go, what are you noticing? What's coming up? And you need a sentence or two. You would say, I can see myself trying to get out of the car and I'm stuck. It's like, how does that feel? Well, it feels like I'm stuck. I can't get out. Poof. Okay. Stop right there. No more talking.
Back.
And then
back to the movement. And then another couple, what now? What are you noticing? And as you do that 10, 12 times, where you started at 10 minutes versus where you're at now at 50 minutes of the session, the work is happening without your knowledge. You may not even necessarily want to heal, but it's happening for you in a way that's outside of your control. So you're going, I could see myself being stuck, but then somebody does show up and I get out. And, I never thought of this, but I'm grateful that this person just happened to be there.
What if this was just the like prehistory of some sort of technology where we could get to a point where we could like engineer everything in someone's head, right? You could plant memories.
Well, it seems like it's tricking your brain.
You could create,
right? Like it's
make me think
right?
I'm, whatever I want, and give me whatever type of emotional response,
and that works too. It's like,
we order it on a menu, and you can just.
Well, it is that, and Joe Dispenza will back that up. Yeah. It's literally that. It's like, why don't you identify who you want to be? Well, I want to be secure. I want to be confident. I want to be successful. I want to be fit. It's like, just tell me what it is. That's your ideal self, right. Financially, romantically, whatever, physically. And if you have clarity, then you have like a sort of a sense of direction.
Yeah, which helps. It's like having an ideal to move towards, being able to visualize.
But then you tell a story according to that list. So you might say, well, I had a terrible upbringing that was extremely horrific and limiting. So you want me to basically lie and say, it's like, yes, you think your brain can tell the difference? No, it cannot. If I'm having an anxiety attack on this chair, talking about my flight to Phoenix tomorrow and how I'm terrified of flying, it would be the exact same process neurologically as the one I'm having on the plane on my way to Phoenix. Mm-hmm. The body can't tell the difference. The thoughts are so powerful. The brain is such a powerful mechanism that my thoughts alone will take me right there as if no time has passed. So if I can take myself from a state of stability to completely unraveled and falling apart as a result of like thoughts about the details of my traumatic event, by definition, I could do the same thing the other way around. I can take myself from current state to optimal, completely, all the ways that I want to thrive. It's like, I can see that. So if I can't imagine it, I can't get there. That's the thing. When we're sticking with the story for many months and years in therapy, If I can't imagine what it's like to be effective and to gone past this, then I can't get there. So a good tool, for instance, would be, why don't you pretend like what it's like to have confidence? Like, well, what do you mean? I don't have confidence. That's why I'm here, for you to teach me, so that by 8 months from now, I would have more confidence.
Is that like fake it till you make it?
But that's,
It is.
time is not a tool.
Well, I mean, I think that there we need to have we have to remember where we came from, but we also have to know where we want to go. And
not having a name.
If we disregard either, we're in a bad space. Right?
Yeah, because sinning is
if we're all just
missing
where
the
we
mark.
want to go, then we're just blah dee da dee da, like it didn't happen, blah blah blah, you know.
But Eckhart Tolle gets into this, where if you're holding a flashlight and walking down a dark road, all you really can see is like 8 feet in front of you. And that's all you really need to see, right? Is wherever I'm pointing the flashlight is where I'm seeing. And so just stay with that. So if my goal is to be fit, is to work on my physical stability, is to be whatever I want to be, focus on that. It's like, well, I can't focus on that because now I'm triggered and I can't leave the house. Do you see how it's like, well, how are we supposed to help people if ultimately you always go back to like, yeah, I would love to show up, but like my anxiety won't let me.
Mm-hmm. How?
That's the over-identification with the labeling and the diagnosis,
How
though. So, how we help them is, for therapists that are seeing this point of view, is to basically stop being therapists because it's just too painful to watch, or have very limited.
To stop being therapists
in terms of
altogether,
like,
throwing the towel, or
not
stop
altogether, but
changing your role with them,
really
and not...
changing it and limiting it, and that does affect you financially in terms of, rather than whoever can pay me, I'm going to be more specific with the kind of person I want to work with. You know, it's not a one-side street. So as much as you're seeing if you like me, I'm seeing if I like you, right? And so what I do typically is, therapy is not this sort of, let's just see what happens. I give it about 6 to 8 months. If there's no distinct shift in perception, or like a pretty identifiable change in your life, then you got to go to somebody else and have a different experience, because I'm not effective, right? I'm not saying things have to work out great and now everything that was an issue doesn't have to be there, because a lot of times growth actually looks like falling apart. So you may have come to therapy with a relatively stable, functioning life with your partner and with your job, but 3 months into therapy, you can't leave the house and you're just a hot mess.
Yeah, you just try to get out of a room.
And that could be growth for you, because you've picked things apart and it looks messy, but
still
then we
probably
put
not
it back
time
together.
to stop therapy.
No, that's not the time.
Yeah.
You don't scratch the wound and have them walk out with blood, trail.
But knowing the time and being, in the, treatment world that I work in, there is this ongoing conflict, conversation, debate around keep the client or send them on their way. The clinicians are actually more incentivized to refer out, like they've done 90 days. Okay, good job. On to the next chapter. And the people who are like watching the dollars and cents are like, are you sure? I think that, they got another couple months of off left. Like maybe we can think of some things to talk about. And, and so that, and both have points. I hate to say it,
Why do you hate to say it?
Why do I hate to say it? Well, because it's to give credence to the point of the ones who's like making sure the lights stay on, it seems greedy and it seems uncaring. Yeah.
But don't get me wrong. So it's not that, for instance, bipolar disorder or borderline disorder. Yeah, these are guidances, basically. They very much serve a purpose. It's just that they have far exceeded their intended purpose. So rather than direction for me to identify, categorize, like have a criteria of this is my symptoms, this is what it means, I have now taken it on to be my absolute and ultimate reality and identification. But as long as I look at it like, this is how it affects my relationships, and these are the ways that it keeps me limited, and what's the solution, right? When it comes to BPD, for instance, it's very real. I mean, it's 100%,
What's BPD?
By a borderline personality disorder. Ooh. A lot of eating disorder, a lot of childhood sexual abuse is behind borderline, which is this complete lack of this too shall pass. Like, that just doesn't exist. What is happening now is 100% a fact of my life, and it will never change. That's how it feels. So you see somebody who's acting like a child and falling apart because something, seemingly trivial happened.
That's
and you're
not their
going,
experience.
what the? It's like, no, for them, the world is ending.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the kid that's having a massive tantrum in the aisle at Vaughn's because you said no to something. Like their life as
over.
they know it is over, right? And so as a therapist, I don't see you being crazy. I see you as having regressed into a state that I would most likely want to tap into. But the average person is going like, stay away from this girl.
person's
Like,
a
she's
psycho.
nuts.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Because it doesn't look good in an adult bodysuit.
And that's why I
Yeah.
think in our relationships, we're far more effective, because any number of things that, for instance, you would have done or I would have done would have been sufficient enough to say, yeah, this is not good. We should be out. Like, that would be the responsible thing to do. But then as you learn more about your own psyche and just this process, you go, I can't hold you responsible for something that you were not even present for, because the version that I'm leaving you for is not the version that I said yes to begin with.
Yeah. I thought about it yesterday when I drove to the valley. I was thinking about something, and I had some strong opinions about it. And after I left the valley, I felt totally different about that thing, And it was just me being in a different space. But
Was it a booty call? Or what was going
I mean,
on?
not exactly. It wasn't. But it was about.
That's kind of it'll
It's
shift
an
your
analogy.
perception.
That's what you know.
No, I didn't go. I didn't go out there for booty call, but I did. I was thinking about one.
That's what I was talking about. Yeah.
And I thought one way about it, and then I went and did something, and then I came back and I felt totally different.
You're vaguely.
If you backtrack anymore,
Yeah.
you hurt yourself.
Yeah, you're vaguely being obscure with the details.
I am. You want to get into the details?
Yes. Yeah, come on.
Well, it was just like a she, someone that I'm like, this is a common back and forth. Like, I got to cut this off. Like, this is not good. Like, it's not going anywhere.
Toxic relationship.
Yeah, it's like I should just block them. I should just tell them like, hey,
somebody
I
needs to
can't-
pull the plug here.
Yeah, like
It's
this
not
is
good.
this is not good for any of us. It's not good for my
But
self-esteem.
something's talking to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then later on, I was like, hey, here's a text message. But the funny thing is that the really the person who said hey in the text message was probably a healthier person. Not to say that I shouldn't but that I was more of in a state of like a upset child, prior, which is not a very lucid way,
Okay.
to think about things when your feelings are hurt, and so we
Yes.
kind of learn to not react from those places when we can identify like, oh yeah, I'm in like an aggressive, like I've been hijacked. My nervous system is activated. Like I should probably pump the brakes a little bit. But when it's different, it can completely alter someone's perspective.
Well, yes, and there are limitations. I wouldn't say this to a battered woman, for instance, and say, well, the person that was beating you is not the person that you love and who's buying you flowers and so apologetic. Like, so there are limitations around this.
They're not the same person.
And they're not. That's
Yeah.
true. But that doesn't mean you should stay.
Yeah.
Right? Because if
Because they still are the other person.
if it happens more than once,
They're both people.
the pathology is far beyond anything you can resolve as a couple.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now the danger far exceeds the good that could
If
potentially
it happens
come.
more than once,
More than once.
so once is cool.
Once is not cool, but once. Once meaning like if there's any form of physical hostility or reaction.
Is that an
or
actual
response.
like rule of thumb that people use?
No, everybody
Okay.
has their own. I
Okay.
think this is just mine.
Yeah.
In terms of somebody may show up in a way that's just going, I don't even know who this is in
But
front of me right now.
if they kind of go, whoa,
But if there's understanding and awareness
And wanna work
it's
on it.
like reflection, and they can go, that was insane and that is not okay, and these are the non-negotiables in terms of how I expect myself to show up and what
Yeah.
I'm expecting you, and actually follow through with that. But if it were to happen every other month even, like then it's toxic. So toxic is one thing versus we can watch each other fall apart in our childhood ways, but help one another mature and actually work through them. And so you can look back and go, the version of us 5 years ago versus today, can you honestly look and say, we've grown, we've done some work, we've matured, not as a couple necessarily, but as individuals? And if the answer is yes, then you're on the right path. But if, then that's the difference between enabling versus actual healing. Because if you just keep saying, well, that's not who they are, I know the real version, and it's like this loving person, that's enabling. There has to be actual noticeable change that you could go, you know what, it's been like a few years since I've seen that. So something must be going on. This is not just some person that thinks they're going to get away with behaving that way and it's okay.
So final question, do you think you're going to continue to be a therapist for the rest of your working years, or are you?
It's questionable.
Yeah.
It's questionable because I
think you love therapy.
I do love it, but I think it's changing for me from what it was, let's say 10 years ago, to what it can be.
Maybe you're just becoming a better therapist.
I'm more picky. I'm a much better therapist because I'm a much better person in terms of my own understanding. So as I've done the work and as I have let go of my own excuses and limitations, I expect more now from the other, right? So it's just not fulfilling for me to talk about how terrible your upbringing was and how it has made you limited, and that's why you can't pursue relationships that are meaningful. That was once my narrative, and that worked great with all clients. Versus now that I'm sort of on the other side of that going, well, that's kind of bullshit, because no matter where I come from, like we were talking about before, what I'm, what's here for me today in terms of my ability to live where I live and pursue all the things I want is as much as anybody else who wasn't exposed to all the things, right? So I have no excuse.
Would you say you do more of pulling people out of stories than bringing them into
Yes,
stories?
That I would love to do, and I think that's the change. Rather than staying with the same clients for years, for instance, I would like to do more short-term work and serve my purpose, and then have them move on to somebody who does maybe somatic experiencing or does different types of work. That would be much more fulfilling than sort of staying within the same type of dialogue for years and years.
Yeah, well,
or just graduating from therapy. You know what I mean, right? Like that Jungian idea, like you change and then you don't need therapy anymore.
I mean, Jung did that where
Yeah.
he just was like, you know what, this is too much. He just kind of locked himself in Zurich somewhere in a village with
in a
it was
cabin.
like a castle.
Yeah.
It was like a castle.
took
lots of
psychedelics
stone.
and wrote the Red Book. And
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And
Started
he just
tripping on dreams. Yeah.
So that could be the next
step for
next
you.
step.
All right.
I'll be right along the ride.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you for
Thank you,
having
Shirin.
me.